They sent one message. Just one. 30 words broadcasted across the Orion Spur on all frequencies. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a plea. It was an eviction notice. The Zelxi High Command laughed. They thought we were soft, broken. They thought our scattered agricultural colonies were ripe for the taking. They ignored the warning. Now their skies are burning, their soil is soaked in copper blood, and they are learning the hardest lesson of all. Humans don't fight to conquer. We fight to exterminate. The mud sucked at Dean's boots. It was thick, greedy stuff, the color of bruised plums. He pulled his right foot free with a wet, tearing sound, the stench of sulfur and rotting vegetation hitting the back of his throat. He swallowed hard, trying to force down the sour taste of recycled water and the MRE he'd choked down 14 hours ago. His knees ached, a dull, grinding pain that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. He ignored it. You didn't survive this long on a hunting rotation by listening to your joints. Ahead of him, Carter held up a fist. The squad froze. 6 men and women, clad in matte black synthetic armor that was scraped, dented, and caked in the omnipresent violet mud of this unnamed moon. Nobody spoke. Nobody tapped their comms. Silence was their religion now. Dean dropped to a crouch, the servo motors in his knee joints whining softly, a sound he instantly hated. He rested the heavy barrel of his kinetic rifle across his forearm. The metal was freezing. Condensation beaded on the composite housing, freezing into tiny ice crystals. He wiped them away with a thumb, feeling the grit of dirt against his skin. He stared at the tree line. The flora here was wrong. Tall, jagged things that looked more like obsidian glass than wood, with leaves that rattled like razor blades in the biting wind. It smelled like ammonia and burnt hair. The Zelxi were close. Dean could feel it in the air, a heavy, static pressure that made the hairs on his arms stand up. They excreted a chemical when they were terrified. It smelled exactly like old pennies and bleach. He flared his nostrils. There it was, faint but clinging to the damp air. They ignored the warning. The thought drifted through his mind, unbidden, as it always did when the hunt drew close. 3 months ago, the Zelxi Armada had dropped into the airspace of New Wichita. They didn't hail. They didn't demand surrender. They just opened fire with orbital lasers, turning 4 million people and 3 continents of wheat into glass and ash. Humanity's response hadn't been a speech. It hadn't been a declaration of war read by politicians in clean suits. It was a single text broadcast sent from Earth Naval Command. Leave our space in 24 hours, or we will hunt you until your species is a footnote. The Zelxi had replied with a mocking string of binary, translating roughly to an invitation to try. They thought they were dealing with a civilized prey species. They didn't understand that humanity's civilization was just a thin, fragile crust over an ocean of evolutionary violence. Carter lowered his fist and pointed 2 fingers toward a cluster of shattered obsidian trees. Dean squinted through the thermal optic of his visor. There, a heat signature, faint and pulsing, huddled beneath the roots. Then another, and another. 3 of them. They weren't soldiers. Not anymore. The Zelxi warrior caste wore heavy, carapace-like armor that glowed hot in the infrared. These signatures were small, shivering, unprotected. Stragglers. Maybe a logistics crew left behind when their transport was blown out of the sky last night. Dean felt nothing. No triumph, no pity, just a hollow, scraping exhaustion. His hands were shaking, a subtle tremor in his fingers born from too much adrenaline and too little sleep. He gripped the rifle tighter, pressing the stock into his shoulder until it bruised, forcing the tremor to stop. Miller, flanking to Dean's left, racked the bolt of his rifle. The metallic clack-clack was deafening in the stillness. The heat signatures jerked. They had heard it. The hunt was back on. Dean stood up. His legs felt like lead, but he moved forward, stepping carefully over the slick roots. He wasn't a hero. Before the sky fell on New Wichita, he had been an HVAC technician. He spent his days arguing with landlords about coolant leaks. Now, he was a butcher. And the worst part, the part that kept him awake when he finally got back to the barracks, was how easily the transition had happened. He moved through the brush, the razor leaves scraping against his shoulder plates. The smell of bleach and copper grew stronger. They were running, stumbling through the dark, terrified of the slow, methodical footsteps following them. They thought we would fight like them. Grand battles, flanking maneuvers, glorious charges. They didn't know we were persistence predators. We don't need to outrun you. We just need to never, ever stop walking. The rain started. Cold, stinging drops that felt like needles against the exposed skin of Dean's neck. It turned the violet dirt into a treacherous slush. They tracked the 3 Zelksy for 2 miles up a steep, jagged ravine. The aliens were fast, their 4 multi-jointed legs built for sprinting, but they had no stamina. Dean found the first sign of their collapse halfway up the ridge, a smear of thick, cyan blood on a rock, alongside a discarded rebreather mask. "They're flagging," Carter muttered over the localized squad channel, his voice a low gravel rasp. "Keep the spacing. Watch the ridge." Dean stepped over the blood smear. He didn't look at it. His eyes constantly scanned the shadows, the corners of his vision jumping at every falling leaf. His heart thumped a heavy, irregular rhythm against his ribs. They crested the ravine. Below them, nestled in a concave depression of the rock face, was the end of the trail. It was a pathetic sight. The 3 Zelksy were backed against the slick stone wall. In the dim grey light of the storm, Dean could see them clearly. They were tall, nearly 7 feet, with elongated, chitinous torsos and pale, translucent skin stretched tight over an endoskeleton. Their 4 eyes, usually a bright, arrogant yellow, were dilated and frantic. One of them was leaning heavily against the rock, clutching its side. The cyan blood was pooling around its clawed feet. Dean lowered himself onto one knee, resting his elbow on his thigh to stabilize the heavy rifle. Beside him, Miller and Hayes did the same. There was no grand command, no dramatic countdown. The Zelksy in the center raised a weapon, a sleek, silver arc pistol. Its hand was trembling so violently the weapon rattled. It let out a high-pitched, clicking screech. A threat, a plea. Dean didn't care. Carter fired first. The suppressed kinetic rifle coughed, a dull thwack that sounded like a heavy book hitting a table. The Zelksy with the pistol jerked backward, its chest caving in violently as the tungsten round shattered its sternum. It didn't scream. It just collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, Chian blood spraying in a wide arc against the wet stone. The reality of the engagement was messy. It wasn't a clean, clinical strike. The second Zelksy lunged, not away, but forward. A desperate, terrified charge toward Hayes. It closed the distance shockingly fast, its jaws unhinging to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. Hayes slipped. The mud gave way under his boot, and he went down hard on his back. The alien was on him in a second, claws scrabbling against Hayes's chest plate, screeching a horrible, metallic sound. Dean didn't think. Muscle memory, drilled into him over 3 months of hell, took over. He snapped his rifle sideways, didn't even bother aiming through the optic, and pulled the trigger. Thwack, thwack, thwack. 3 rounds tore through the air. The first missed, shattering a rock behind the alien. The second caught the Zelksy in the shoulder, spinning it. The third took it in the lower jaw, obliterating the lower half of its face. The creature fell off Hayes, writhing in the mud, thrashing violently. Its legs kicked against the rocks, dislodging stones. The smell of ammonia spiked, thick and suffocating. Dean stood up, walking forward. His breathing was heavy, ragged. He stood over the thrashing alien, its two remaining eyes rolled up to look at him. There was no intelligence left in them, just raw, unadulterated agony. Dean aimed down, placed the barrel an inch from its skull, and pulled the trigger once more. The thrashing stopped. "You good?" Carter asked, offering a hand down to Hayes. "Yeah," Hayes grunted, taking the hand and pulling himself up. He was covered in mud and blue blood. He spat on the ground. Bastard was quick. Dean looked over at the third Zelksy, the one that had been bleeding. It hadn't moved. It was slumped against the wall, its breathing shallow and erratic. It watched them with dulling eyes. It didn't raise its hands. It just waited. Carter walked over to it. He drew his sidearm, a heavy-caliber revolver that looked comically archaic compared to the alien's sleek tech. "Any intel on it?" Miller asked, chewing absent-mindedly on the plastic stem of a ration pack spoon. "No," Carter said. "Just a technician." Carter raised the gun. The Zelksy let out a soft, clicking sigh and closed its eyes. Bang! The sound echoed loudly in the ravine, startling a flock of leathery-winged native birds into the storm. Dean lowered his rifle. The encounter had lasted less than 40 seconds. His ears were ringing. He felt a bead of sweat roll down his spine beneath the heavy armor, pooling at his belt line. He tasted copper in his mouth. He had bitten his lip hard enough to bleed. He looked at the three bodies. They were just meat now. Broken, leaking meat in the mud. He waited for the satisfaction to hit. The righteous anger. The vengeance for New Wichita. It never came. There was only the cold rain, the smell of bleach, and the crushing weight of his own exhaustion. "Check their packs," Carter ordered, his voice devoid of emotion. "Grab any data drives. Leave the rations. We keep moving." Dean knelt beside the one he had shot. He rummaged through the webbing across its chest, his gloved hands slick with cyan blood. He found a small hexagonal data drive and slipped it into his pouch. As he pulled his hand away, his wrist brushed against the alien's arm. It was still warm. He swallowed the bile rising in his throat and stood up. Night fell on the moon like a suffocating blanket. There were no stars here, only the thick, swirling canopy of ash and storm clouds. The temperature plummeted, freezing the mud into hard, jagged ruts that threatened to snap an ankle with every misstep. Dean's squad pushed deeper into the jagged mountain range. Command had picked up a larger heat bloom in a cave network 6 miles north, a proper FOB, maybe 30 as Zelksy. 30 targets. Dean marched in silence. His legs moved mechanically. Left, right, left, right. The pain in his knees had dulled into a numb, throbbing ache. His mind wandered, detaching from the physical misery of the march. He thought about his apartment back on Earth. He thought about the humming of his refrigerator, the smell of cheap coffee brewing in the morning. He clung to those memories like a drowning man clings to driftwood. If he let them go, there would be nothing left but the mud and the killing. At 0200 hours, they reached the mouth of the cave network. It was a massive fissure in the obsidian rock face, venting warm, stale air into the freezing night. The entrance was barricaded with scrap metal and the scorched hull of a downed Zelksy transport. Carter halted the squad with a sharp hand gesture. He tapped the side of his helmet, switching to the tight beam comms. "Thermal shows 28 signatures inside," Carter whispered, his voice tinny in Dean's earpiece. "They're huddled deep, 2 on watch at the barricade. They're not using active scanners. They're blind." "They're exhausted," Miller chimed in. "They've been running for a week." "Then we wake them up," Carter said. "Breach and clear. No survivors. Dean crept up to the right side of the fissure, pressing his back against the freezing, razor-sharp rock. He pulled a flashbang grenade from his chest rig, his thumb resting on the pin. His heart began that familiar, heavy pounding. The adrenaline dumped into his system, making his vision tunnel, sharpening the edges of the dark world. He looked across the gap at Hayes. Hayes nodded. Dean pulled the pin. He didn't toss it over the barricade. He rolled it through a gap in the scrap metal, letting it bounce off the stone floor deeper into the tunnel. 1, 2. A blinding white flash erupted from the cave, accompanied by a concussive crack that rattled Dean's teeth. Before the echo even faded, Carter and Hayes vaulted the barricade. Dean followed a second later, his rifle up, scanning the smoke-filled corridor. The two Zelksy on watch were flailing, their sensitive eyes completely burned out by the magnesium flash. Miller dropped them both with 2 clean shots to the head before they could even unholster their weapons. They pushed deeper. The cave sloped downward, the air growing thick and hot. The smell of ammonia was overpowering here, mixed with the stench of alien waste and fear. They rounded a bend, and the cavern opened up into a massive natural amphitheater. It was a slaughterhouse waiting to happen. The Zelksy were in a panic. The flashbang had woken them. They were scrambling, knocking over supply crates, desperately reaching for weapons. But they were slow. Their movements were sluggish, completely drained by days of terror and running. Dean didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle, planted his feet, and began to fire. The cavern turned into a deafening strobe light of muzzle flashes and plasma bolts. The Zelksy fired back, but their shots were wild, searing into the ceiling and the rock walls. Dean moved with terrifying mechanical precision. He tracked a target, exhaled, pulled the trigger, tracked the next. It wasn't combat. It was a harvest. He saw a massive Zelksy, an officer judging by the crimson markings on its carapace, hoist a heavy plasma cannon. Dean took a knee, aimed for the center of mass, and fired twice. The heavy rounds punched through the alien's armor, dropping it instantly. The plasma cannon hit the floor and discharged, taking the leg off another Zelksy next to it. The screams were awful, high-pitched, warbling shrieks that echoed off the stone walls, piercing right through the dampening filters in Dean's helmet. Within 2 minutes, it was over. The cavern was silent, save for the hiss of melting rock where plasma had struck, and the wet, ragged breathing of the dying. Cyan blood painted the walls and pooled thick on the uneven floor. Dean dropped his empty magazine. It clattered loudly against the stone. He slotted a fresh one with a sharp slap, his hands moving entirely on their own. He was breathing hard, the stale air burning his lungs. He walked through the carnage, stepping over limbs and shattered armor. Near the back of the cave, beneath a natural stone overhang, Dean saw movement. He raised his rifle, the flashlight beam cutting through the smoke. It was a Zelksy, young by the looks of its pale, unhardened carapace. It had no weapon. It was curled into a tight ball, its 4 hands wrapped around its head, trembling violently. Dean stopped. He kept the rifle leveled at its chest. The alien slowly lowered its hands and looked up into the beam of Dean's flashlight. Its 4 yellow eyes were wide, leaking a clear fluid. Tears. It didn't screech. It didn't try to run. It looked at Dean. Really looked at him. Past the armor, past the rifle. And Dean realized, with a cold, sinking feeling in his gut, what the alien saw. It didn't see a soldier. It didn't see a hero avenging his fallen world. It saw a monster, a relentless, dead-eyed apex predator that crawled out of the dark, immune to fatigue, devoid of mercy, driven only by the mathematics of extinction. The Zelksy let out a soft, whimpering click. It pressed its back harder against the stone, offering its throat, surrendering to the monster. Dean's finger hovered over the trigger. His hands were shaking again. The tremor was worse this time. He felt the weight of the last 3 months pressing down on his chest, threatening to crush him. He was so tired, he just wanted to go home. "Dean," Carter's voice was right behind him. Cold, flat. "Clear it." Dean looked at the young alien. He looked at the cyan blood coating his boots. He tasted the copper in his mouth. They ignored the warning. Dean closed his eyes, steadied his breathing, and pulled the trigger. The cavern went silent again. Dean lowered his rifle. He didn't look at the body. He turned around, walking past Carter, past Miller, back toward the entrance of the cave, where the freezing rain and the ash were still falling. He had a job to do. The trail wasn't over. There were more of them out there in the dark. And humanity would never, ever stop walking. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving behind a thick, freezing fog that clung to the jagged valley floor. Visibility dropped to less than 30 meters. Command designated a temporary halt. 4 hours. Not enough time to sleep, barely enough time to die. They took shelter beneath the hollowed-out carcass of a massive, indigenous beetle-like creature. Its chitinous shell was a dull gray, picked clean by scavengers long ago, providing a natural dome against the biting wind. Dean sat on a flat rock, his helmet resting between his boots. The air was brutally cold, stinging his flushed face. He ran a gloved hand through his sweat-matted hair, wincing as his fingers brushed a tender knot at the base of his skull. The constant friction of the helmet's neural link pads was rubbing his skin raw, leaving weeping sores that refused to heal in the damp environment. He pulled a foil packet from his chest rig. Standard-issue caloric paste. He tore the top off with his teeth and squeezed the gray sludge into his mouth. It tasted like drywall dust mixed with artificial beef flavoring. He swallowed it dry, feeling it coat his throat like paste. Beside him, Gibson was working on a jammed rifle. The squad's designated marksman was a quiet guy from a colony orbiting Proxima, with hands that were currently black with carbon scoring. "Extractor claw is sheared," Gibson murmured, his voice hoarse. He didn't look up. He just methodically dragged a steel file against the broken metal. The grating sound set Dean's teeth on edge. Shk, shk, shk. "Can you fix it?" Carter asked. The squad leader was standing near the entrance of the shell, staring out into the grey fog. He hadn't taken his helmet off. Carter never took his helmet off in the field. "I can file down the burr, force it to cycle," Gibson replied, blowing away a pinch of steel dust. "But it's going to chew up the brass. Might get 3, maybe 4 shots before it stovepipes again." "Make it work," Carter said flatly. Dean looked down at his own armor. The matte black synthetic weave was marred by long, jagged gouges. The cayenne blood from the cave had dried. It didn't flake off like human blood. It cured into a stiff, resin-like crust. He drew his combat knife and began scraping it off his thigh plate. Scrape, scrape. It smelled like dried bleach and copper. It was the smell of New Wichita's vengeance. Dean wondered, not for the first time, how much of that dried resin belonged to soldiers, and how much belonged to the terrified technician in the ravine. He pushed the thought away. It was a dangerous train to board. Empathy was a luxury of peacetime. If you started looking into the 4 yellow eyes of the Zelksai and seeing people, you hesitated. And out here, hesitation meant a plasma bolt through the lungs. "Command just pinged the local net," Carter said, breaking the rhythmic scraping of Dean's knife. The squad leader tapped his wrist gauntlet, projecting a grainy blue holographic map into the damp air. The orbital blockade caught 2 Zelksai transports trying to break its atmosphere, blew them to slag. but one of them managed to dump a drop pod before it cooked off. It landed 10 clicks west of us. Heavy gorge terrain. Troops? Hayes asked, shifting his weight from where he leaned against the shell wall. He was favoring his left leg from the scramble in the mud earlier. Unknown, Carter said, but the pod is broadcasting a localized low-frequency repeating signal. Command thinks it's a rally point for the stragglers. A beacon. Miller scoffed, tossing an empty ration wrapper into the mud. They're gathering the herd. Exactly. Carter collapsed the map, plunging them back into the gloomy grey light. Command wants us to hit the beacon. Wipe the rally point before they can organize a proper defensive perimeter. We move in 20 mics. Dean slid his knife back into its sheath with a soft click. 20 minutes. His legs felt like they were filled with wet cement. The dull ache in his knees had spread to his lower back, a constant, grinding throb. He didn't complain. None of them did. They just strapped their helmets back on. As the neural link pads pressed into the raw sores on the back of his neck, Dean hissed through his teeth. The helmet's internal HUD flickered to life, washing his vision in a sterile amber glow. Vitals green. Ammo at 40%. Ambient temperature minus 12 degrees Celsius. He picked up his rifle. It was heavy. He chambered a round. The hunt was moving west. The gorge was a jagged scar cut deep into the moon's crust. Its walls were sheer faces of black rock, slick with condensation and choked with creeping, thorny vines that looked like rusted barbed wire. The squad moved in single file along a narrow goat path halfway up the southern wall. The drop to their right was a sheer plunge into an abyss of fog. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on loose shale and the howling of the wind funneling through the canyon. Dean took the rear guard. He kept his rifle trained backward, scanning the empty fog. The paranoia was setting in, that creeping, cold sensation at the base of the spine that told you eyes were on you. Signal is getting stronger, Carter relayed over the comms. 200 meters ahead. The path widens into a basin. Dean turned his head forward. He could barely see Gibson's back through the mist. Suddenly, a loud metallic clang echoed through the gorge. It sounded like a massive iron bell being struck. The squad froze. Movement, Miller hissed. Above us, on the ridge. Dean snapped his rifle up, aiming at the sheer cliff face to their left. Through the thermal optic, the fog was a mess of swirling blue cold. Then he saw it. A single, bright orange heat bloom, leaning over the precipice 50 feet above them. It wasn't holding a plasma rifle. It was holding a massive, jagged boulder. "Contact front! Above!" Dean yelled. The Zelksai shoved the rock. It wasn't just one rock. It was a trigger. The boulder crashed into a precariously balanced outcrop of shale, shattering it. The sound was deafening, a localized thunderclap. Tons of loose stone, mud, and jagged obsidian sheared off the cliff face and cascaded down toward the narrow path. "Wall! Hug the wall!" Carter roared. Dean threw himself against the cliff face, pressing his body as flat as the heavy armor would allow. The avalanche hit them like a freight train. Dust and pulverized rock filled the air, choking the filters in Dean's helmet. Fist-sized stones battered his shoulder plates, glancing off his helmet with sickening cracks. He squeezed his eyes shut, gripping his rifle until his knuckles popped, waiting to be swept over the edge into the void. The roar lasted for 10 agonizing seconds. Then it slowed to a rumble, and finally, the rattling patter of pebbles. Dean opened his eyes. The dust was so thick he couldn't see his own boots. "Sound off!" Carter's voice cracked over the static-filled comms. "Miller, good. Gibson, good." Silence. "Hayes? Dean?" "I'm up!" Dean coughed, his throat raw despite the helmet's scrubbers. He pushed himself off the wall. His left arm throbbed intensely where a rock had struck his bicep, but the armor held. "Hayes!" Carter yelled, the rigid discipline in his voice fracturing just a fraction. The dust began to settle. 10 feet ahead, the path had been completely obliterated. Where solid rock had been, there was now a gaping, concave bite taken out of the cliff, and on the very edge of the precipice, buried up to his waist in jagged shale, was Hayes. He was thrashing, his hands frantically clawing at the rock trapping his legs. "I'm slipping!" he screamed, the panic raw and unfiltered over the comms. "The ledge is giving way!" Dean surged forward, scrambling over the loose debris. The ground beneath his boots felt soft, unstable. Carter was already there, grabbing the drag handle on the back of Hayes's chest plate. "Pull!" Carter grunted. Dean grabbed Hayes's left shoulder strap and threw his weight backward. The rocks groaned. Hayes screamed in agony as the jagged shale ground against his pinned legs. Above them, another metallic clang rang out. Dean looked up. 3 more Zelksi were peering over the ridge. They weren't soldiers in heavy carapace armor. They were stripped down to their pale underchiton, gaunt and starved. And they were armed with scavenged mining lasers and sharpened lengths of metal hull plating. "They're swarming!" Gibson yelled from the rear. His compromised rifle barked. "Thwack! Thwack! Thwack!" One of the Zelksi on the ridge jerked and tumbled over the edge, plummeting into the fog below. But 2 more took its place. They weren't using advanced tactics. They weren't using suppressing fire. They were using gravity and desperation. They had realized they couldn't outgun the humans, so they were trying to crush them like insects. A crude, handmade explosive, a plasma cell wrapped in shrapnel, landed on the path 3 feet from Dean. It sparked with unstable green energy. "Grenade!" Dean roared. He let go of Hayes, grabbed the heavy explosive, and hurled it into the abyss. It detonated mid-air, a blinding green flash that sent a concussive shockwave hammering against the cliff face. The ledge groaned loudly. "Pull him out now!" Carter yelled. Dean grabbed Hayes again. "Ignore the pain, Hayes. Move!" With a sickening, wet, tearing sound, they yanked Hayes free of the rocks. Hayes collapsed onto the solid section of the path, screaming as his right leg bent at an unnatural, horrifying angle. The armor over his thigh was crushed inward, cyan and red blood mixing in the dirt where a piece of alien shrapnel had pierced the joint. "Miller, suppress the ridge," Carter ordered, dragging Hayes backward toward the safety of an overhang. Dean raised his rifle, aiming upward. A Zelksi leaped from the ridge, a sharpened pipe raised above its head, aiming straight for Carter's back. It was a suicidal drop. They were 20 feet up. Dean tracked the falling alien. Time seemed to slow down. He could see the ribs showing through its translucent skin. He could see the absolute, fanatic terror in its yellow eyes. It wasn't fighting for the glory of the Zelksi High Command. It was fighting because it was cornered. Dean fired a single round. It caught the falling alien in the chest, stopping its momentum mid-air. The creature slammed into the cliff face and tumbled down, landing with a wet crunch at Dean's feet. It was still alive. It thrashed, reaching out with a bloodied claw, grasping blindly at Dean's boot. It clicked frantically, bloody foam bubbling from its mandibles. Dean didn't use a bullet. He stepped down hard, bringing the heavy heel of his armored boot directly onto the creature's skull. The crunch was loud. The thrashing stopped. "Ridge is clear!" Miller shouted, his breathing heavy. Dean turned back to the squad. Carter was kneeling over Hayes. The medic had a tourniquet wrapped high on Hayes's thigh, twisting the windlass tight. Hayes was hyperventilating, his hands gripping the mud so hard his knuckles were white. "Femur is snapped," Carter said, his voice back to that terrifying, flat calm. "Arterial bleed is stopped. I'm hitting him with morphine." Carter jammed a localized auto-injector into Hayes's neck. The wounded man gasped, his eyes rolling back slightly as the heavy narcotics flooded his system. Dean stared at the dead Zelksi at his feet. They had laid a trap, a primitive, brutal trap. And it had worked. They had taken a human out of the fight. "They're adapting," Gibson muttered, staring at the avalanche debris. "It doesn't matter," Carter said, standing up. He looked down at Hayes. "We can't carry him and assault the beacon. We leave him here with a sidearm. We push forward. The beacon is less than 100 meters." Dean looked at Carter, leaving a man behind in the fog, bleeding, with only a pistol. It was a death sentence if the Zelksai came back. But nobody argued, because this wasn't a rescue mission. It was an extermination. "I'll be fine," Hayes slurred, his head lolling against the rock wall. He unholstered his pistol with trembling fingers. "Go kill the bastards." Carter nodded. He didn't offer a platitude. He just racked the bolt of his rifle. "Move out." The path opened into a wide, sunken crater. The fog was thinner here, dispersed by the heat radiating from a makeshift encampment. It was a pathetic sight. A dozen temporary shelters made from the shredded parachute silk of the drop pod and scorched hull plating. In the center stood the beacon, a jury-rigged communications array powered by the pod's salvaged fusion core. Thick cables snaked through the mud like black veins. There were no guards, no perimeter. Dean, Carter, Miller, and Gibson fanned out, moving silently through the camp. The air smelled strongly of ozone, burnt plastic, and the overwhelming stench of bleach. They found the remaining Zelksai huddled in the largest shelter. There were maybe 15 of them, not soldiers. They wore the grey, loose-fitting tunics of the civilian caste. They were packed together for warmth, shivering violently. Some were missing limbs, cauterized cleanly by plasma fire. At the back of the tent, sitting before the glowing console of the comms array, was an older Zelksai. Its chitin was brittle and scarred. It wore a headset, speaking rapidly into a microphone in a low, clicking cadence. Carter raised his hand. "Hold." He tapped a sequence into his wrist gauntlet, syncing the squad's translation software to the ambient audio. A synthesized, monotone voice filled Dean's earpiece, translating the alien's frantic broadcast. "Repeat, this is Sector Commander Vael. We are transmitting on all open frequencies. To the High Command, do not send reinforcements. I repeat, do not send the fleet. The planetary pacification has failed." The old Zelksai paused, coughing wetly. It wiped cyan blood from its mouth and continued. "They do not accept surrender. They do not take prisoners. We attempted to broadcast the standard capitulation, Sci-Fi. They executed the emissary. They do not sleep. They track us through the storms. They use our panic against us. This is not a war. It is a culling." Dean stared through his optic at the old commander. The crosshairs were perfectly centered on the back of its elongated skull. "Abandon the Orion Spur," the commander pleaded into the microphone, its voice cracking. "Quarantine this sector. If you engage the humans, you must obliterate their worlds entirely from orbit. If you leave even a fraction of them alive, they will crawl from the ash, and they will hunt you. May the ancestors forgive us. We woke a plague." The silence in the tent was absolute, broken only by the hum of the fusion core and the weeping of the wounded Zelksai huddled in the dirt. They knew. They finally understood what they had done. They had thought humanity was a candle they could simply blow out. They didn't realize they were stepping into a blast furnace. "Carter," Miller whispered over the private channel. "Do we let it finish the broadcast?" Dean felt a strange, cold knot form in his stomach. The rational part of his brain, the part that used to fix air conditioners and worry about rent, screamed at him to lower the gun. They had won. The enemy was broken. They were begging their own people to flee. The warning had been received. But then he smelled the ash. It wasn't physical ash. It was a phantom smell, a memory burned into his olfactory nerves, the smell of 4 million bodies incinerated in a single afternoon, the smell of his sister's apartment complex in New Wichita, reduced to a blackened crater. The Zelksey High Command hadn't shown mercy to the children in the agricultural domes. They hadn't offered a capitulation cipher before they fired the orbital lasers. Dean's finger tightened on the trigger. He didn't want peace anymore. Peace couldn't unglass New Wichita. No, Carter said over the comms. His voice was completely devoid of humanity. It was the voice of the plague the alien had just described. "Shut it down." Dean didn't wait for Carter to fire first. He squeezed the trigger. The heavy tungsten round shattered the old commander's skull, throwing its body forward over the console. The microphone sparked and died, cutting the broadcast with a sharp burst of static. The tent erupted into pure chaos. The huddled civilian shrieked, scrambling backward, desperately clawing at the dirt, trying to phase through the rock wall behind them. They didn't have weapons, they just had their hands, which they raised to shield their faces. "Fire!" Carter commanded. The squad opened up. Dean moved his rifle methodically from left to right. Thwack, thwack, thwack. There was no return fire. There was no glory. There was only the brutal, sickening mathematics of the harvest. A body fell. He moved to the next. A chest caved in. He moved to the next. He watched a Zelksey mother try to wrap her body around a smaller, younger one. His armor-piercing round went through both of them. He felt nothing. The knot in his stomach was gone. The coldness had spread, freezing his blood, hollowing out his chest until he was nothing more than a meat suit built to pull a trigger. In less than 20 seconds it was quiet again. The air was thick with the smell of copper, bleach, and voided bowels. The blue blood ran in a steady stream down the slope of the tent, pooling around Dean's boots. "Cease fire," Carter said. Dean lowered his rifle. The barrel was smoking, radiating intense heat. "Gibson," Carter ordered. "Rig the fusion core. Set it to overload. We don't leave this tech for them to scavenge." "Copy," Gibson said, his voice hollow. He walked past the pile of bodies toward the console, not looking down. Dean stood still. He looked at the carnage. He looked at his hands. They weren't shaking anymore. They were perfectly steady. That was what terrified him the most. The horror of the cave was gone. The hesitation was gone. The human being who had argued with landlords and drank cheap coffee was officially dead, buried somewhere in the violet mud of this unnamed moon. What was left was exactly what the Zelksey commander had broadcasted to the stars. A monster. 2 minutes on the core, Gibson called out, tapping the final sequence into the explosive charge. "Let's move," Carter said. "We need to get back to Hayes. Command will have another target for us by nightfall." Dean turned around. He walked out of the tent, stepping out of the blue puddle, leaving bloody boot prints on the grey shale. He walked back into the freezing, swirling fog. He didn't look back at the dead. He just kept walking. Left, right, left, right. The hunt wasn't over. It would never be over. Not until the stars themselves were empty. The shockwave from the fusion core overload hit them 3 minutes later. It wasn't a fiery explosion. Zelksey tech didn't burn like human ordnance. It was a concussive pulse of displaced air and hard radiation that flattened the fog and sent a localized tremor rattling through the soles of Dean's boots. He didn't flinch. None of them did. They just leaned into the shockwave, letting the heavy armor absorb the kinetic slap, and kept walking. The trek back up the gorge was slower. The adrenaline dump had receded, leaving behind a toxic, heavy fatigue that settled into the marrow of Dean's bones. His helmet display warned him of dropping core temperatures. The storm was rolling back in, replacing the fog with driving, horizontal sleet that pinged against his visor like thrown gravel. They reached the site of the avalanche. The gouged cliff face looked like a fresh wound in the grey light. "Hayes," Carter called out over the localized net. "Report." Static hissed in Dean's ear. Just the steady, rhythmic shh, kzisk of empty airwaves. "Hayes, sound off." Carter's voice dropped an octave, the flat calm tightening into something dangerous. Dean scrambled over the unstable shale, his rifle raised, ignoring the burn in his thighs. The mud here was mixed with Hayes's blood, frozen into red and blue swirls. He crested the pile of debris, aiming down into the natural overhang where they had left him. Hayes was there. But he wasn't alone. 2 Zelksy bodies lay at the mouth of the overhang. One had a massive, gaping exit wound in its chest, courtesy of Hayes's heavy-caliber sidearm. The other was closer, horrifyingly close. Its long, pale fingers were wrapped around the barrel of the pistol, gripping it so hard the alien's chitin had cracked. Hayes still held the grip, his finger locked tight inside the trigger guard. The alien's skull was a ruined, blackened mess. A point-blank execution. Hayes was slumped against the rock wall. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the sleet falling outside the overhang. The tourniquet was still holding, but his skin was the color of old wax. "Hayes," Dean said, his voice cracking slightly. He dropped to a knee, sliding in the frozen mud, and checked the corporal's pulse. It was there. Faint, fluttering like a dying moth, but there. "Got him," Dean relayed. "He's alive. Barely. Looks like a straggler patrol tried to finish him off." Carter and Miller materialized from the sleet. Carter took one look at the scene, stepped over the dead Zelksy, and knelt beside Hayes. He tapped the side of Hayes's helmet, checking the vitals readouts on the external display. "Morphine wore off. He passed out from the pain," Carter stated, his hands moving quickly over the crushed armor on Hayes's leg. "Miller, prep the evac beacon. Gibson, pull security. They know we're here now." Dean pried the alien's dead fingers off the pistol. The rigidity of death had already set in, the joints stiff and cold. He holstered Hayes's weapon and grabbed the drag handle on his chest rig. "Command is acknowledging the beacon," Miller said, his voice tight. "Dust off in 12 mics. We have to hold the ridge." 12 minutes. It sounded like a lifetime. Dean took his position on the edge of the avalanche debris, finding a notch in the rock to rest his rifle barrel. The sleet was freezing to his armor, forming a thin crust of ice over the dried cyan blood. He stared into the grey void of the gorge. He waited for the fear. He waited for the rapid heartbeat, the shortness of breath, the sheer, animal terror of being hunted. It wasn't there. He just felt empty. A hollowed-out gourd rattling in the wind. He watched the sleet accumulate on the barrel of his rifle. He watched the vapor of his own breath venting from the helmet's exhaust ports. They do not accept surrender. They do not take prisoners. The old commander's broadcast echoed in his mind. Dean squeezed his eyes shut for a second. He pictured New Wichita. He tried to summon the face of his sister, her laugh, the way she used to burn toast every single Sunday. He tried to use the memory as fuel to ignite the righteous anger that had carried him through training and the first drop, but the memory was static, grainy, like a photograph left out in the sun. The sensory details were fading. He could remember the smell of the alien bleach perfectly. He could remember the exact pitch of their death screams, but he couldn't remember what burnt toast smelled like anymore. "Movement," Gibson called out. "Thermal hits, bottom of the gorge, moving up the switchbacks." Dean opened his eyes. The amber HUD in his visor highlighted 6. No, 8 faint heat signatures climbing the narrow goat path. They were slow, desperate, drawn by the noise of the gunshots, or maybe just blindly running from the radiation zone of the camp. "Conserve ammo," Carter ordered. Semi-auto only. Let them get within 200 meters. Dean exhaled. The breath fogged the bottom edge of his visor. He centered the crosshairs on the leading thermal bloom. He was a technician once. Now he was just a gear in a massive grinding machine. The machine only had one function: to reduce complex living organisms into inert matter. 200 meters, Miller whispered. Fire, Carter said. Dean pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The lead thermal bloom winked out. He didn't blink. He shifted the crosshairs to the next target. Exhale. Pull. The brass casing ejected, spinning into the sleet. It wasn't a fight. It was pest control. And the exterminators never, ever quit. The dropship didn't land. It hovered 10 feet above the unstable shale, its twin VTOL thrusters screaming, blasting the sleet and mud into a blinding horizontal vortex. A heavy steel ramp lowered, and the winch cable dropped. Dean and Miller clipped Hayes's harness to the hook. The winch whined, yanking the unconscious man up into the belly of the ship. Carter went next, then Gibson. Dean was the last one on the ground. He hooked his carabiner to the cable. As the winch pulled him upward, he looked down at the gorge. The bodies of the Zelksai they had just shot were already disappearing beneath the accumulating snow and ice. The moon was swallowing them whole. Dean hit the deck of the dropship. The ramp closed with a pressurized hiss, instantly cutting off the roar of the storm. The interior of the ship smelled like aviation fuel, ozone, and old sweat. The red tactical lights bathed the compartment in a harsh, bloody glow. A med-tech in a clean grey jumpsuit was already cutting away Hayes's armor with heavy shears, packing the crushed leg with localized stasis foam. "He'll live," the med-tech yelled over the thrum of the engines, looking up at Carter. "But he's done. Femoral artery is shredded, bone is dust. He's going home." Dean leaned his head back against the cold steel bulkhead. Home. The word sounded foreign, alien. Carter didn't reply to the medic. He unclasped his helmet and pulled it off. It was the first time Dean had seen Carter's face in 3 days. He looked terrible. His skin was pale, deeply lined with exhaustion, his eyes sunken into bruised, purple sockets. A jagged scar ran across his jawline, a souvenir from a piece of shrapnel on their first drop. "Resupply is in the crates." The crew chief, a bulky man chewing on a toothpick, pointed to 2 metal footlockers strapped to the deck. "Command says you have 45 mics to rearm and rehydrate. We're dropping you at grid Delta Niner." Miller paused, a half-empty canteen of water halfway to his mouth. "Delta Niner. That's the primary subterranean complex. We just spent 20 hours humping the gorge. We're down a man." The crew chief shrugged, a gesture devoid of any sympathy. "Orbital scans show the planetary defense grid is offline. The fleet is moving to the next system in 12 hours. Command wants this rock completely sanitized before we jump. The last major heat signature is at Delta Niner. You're the closest asset." Miller slammed the canteen against the bulkhead. "Sanitized? We're exhausted. Our armor is compromised. Gibson's rifle is held together with spit and file dust." "Miller," Carter said. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, terrifying growl. "Check your gear." Miller stared at Carter for a long second, his chest heaving. Then he broke eye contact, muttered a curse, and knelt by the resupply crate. Dean didn't argue. He felt that familiar, heavy resignation settle over him. He stood up, his joints popping, and walked to the crate. He dumped his empty magazines into a canvas bag and began slotting fresh ones into his chest rig. The heavy tungsten rounds were cold to the touch. He grabbed a fresh caloric paste tube and squeezed it down his throat. It tasted like nothing. The ship banked hard, pressing Dean against the bulkhead. Through the tiny reinforced porthole, he could see the orbital bombardment. High above the moon's atmosphere, the human dreadnoughts hung like slivers of black iron. They were firing kinetic rods, massive pillars of dense tungsten dropped from orbit. They hit the surface like meteorites. Great blooming flowers of ash and magma erupted in the distance, silently tearing the moon's crust apart. They weren't just killing the Zelxi, they were killing the biosphere. They were poisoning the dirt so nothing would ever grow here again. A localized genocide. Dean watched the destruction, his reflection superimposed over the burning landscape in the thick glass. His face was smeared with dirt and grease. His eyes were hollow, ringed with red. The man staring back at him was a stranger. "Hey!" A voice broke his trance. Dean turned. A replacement soldier, fresh-faced and wearing pristine, unscratched armor, had walked over from the forward compartment. He couldn't have been older than 20. He looked at Dean with a mix of awe and morbid curiosity. "I heard you guys cleared out the Alpha Communications relay," the kid said, his voice eager. "Is it true? You took out a sector commander?" Dean looked at the kid's clean chest plate. No dried blood. No gouges. "Yeah," Dean said. His voice sounded like grinding stones. "Man, that's incredible." The kid grinned, a fierce, righteous light in his eyes. "Make the bastards pay for New Wichita, right? Every last one of them." Dean stared at the kid. He wanted to shake him. He wanted to grab him by his pristine collar and tell him about the young alien in the cave, shivering, offering its throat. He wanted to tell him about the smell of voided bowels and the wet, terrible sound a skull makes when a boot crushes it. He wanted to tell him that revenge didn't taste sweet. It tasted like ash, and once you started eating it, you could never stop. But he didn't. He couldn't. "Yeah," Dean whispered, turning back to the porthole. "Every last one." "5 minutes to drop," the crew chief shouted over the intercom. "Helmet seals, weapons hot." Dean grabbed his helmet from the bench. He looked at the bloody, weeping sores on the back of his hands, where the gloves rubbed his knuckles raw. He slid the helmet over his head. The neural link pads bit into his neck. The HUD flared amber. Vitals green. Ammo at 100%. Ambient temperature, -18 degrees Celsius. The dreadnoughts continued their silent bombardment. The ash continued to fall. Dean racked the bolt of his rifle. Grid Delta Niner was a massive, subterranean installation carved into the bedrock beneath a frozen alkaline lake. The entrance was a pair of colossal blast doors, blown completely off their hinges by a targeted orbital strike. The dropship didn't touch down. It hovered in the freezing sleet while Dean, Carter, Miller, Gibson, and the new kid, who introduced himself as Ramirez, fast roped down onto the shattered concrete. The air inside the complex was dead. The ventilation systems had failed hours ago. It smelled like melted copper, burning insulation, and the overwhelming, suffocating reek of ammonia. "Night vision," Carter ordered, his voice echoing in the cavernous hallway. "Power grid is completely dead. Keep your spacing." Dean tapped the side of his helmet. The world washed out into a stark, grainy green. The walls were lined with alien script, jagged and harsh, glowing faintly with emergency phosphorescence. They moved deeper. This wasn't a military bunker. Dean realized it almost immediately. There were no weapon racks, no defensive choke points. The hallways were littered with discarded items, small, colorful blocks that looked terrifyingly like toys, torn garments, medical kits. "Command telemetry says the primary heat bloom is on sub-level 4, Gibson reported, sweeping his rifle across a darkened intersection. "It's concentrated. They're packed into a single room." "A vault," Miller said. "Or a tomb," Carter replied. They descended the massive spiral ramp. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft, synced mechanical whine of their armored joints and the crunch of their boots on glass and debris. There was no resistance. The orbital strikes had killed anyone left on the upper levels through pure, concussive force. They passed bodies, stacked against reinforced doors, Zelksai who had died trying to claw their way deeper into the earth. Their pale skin was mottled with hemorrhages, their yellow eyes burst from the pressure wave. Dean didn't look at them. He kept his eyes locked on the back of Carter's helmet. Left, right, left, right. The methodical march of the persistence predator. They reached sub-level 4. A massive, circular vault door dominated the end of the hallway. It was sealed shut, the locking mechanisms fused with heat. "Thermite," Carter commanded. Ramirez, eager to prove himself, stepped forward. He pulled 2 blocks of industrial thermite from his pack, molded them to the locking hinges, and jammed the detonators in. "Setting charges. Back up," Ramirez said, his voice trembling slightly with adrenaline. Dean stepped back behind a structural pillar. He didn't cover his ears. Whoosh! The thermite ignited with a blinding white intensity, chewing through the alien metal in seconds. Molten slag poured onto the floor, hissing and popping as it hit the cold concrete. "Breach," Carter said. Miller and Gibson hit the door with their shoulders. The massive slab of metal groaned, shifted, and crashed inward with a deafening metallic boom. Dean pivoted around the pillar, bringing his rifle up, stepping into the breach. The room was vast, circular, and illuminated only by the faint, pulsing red light of a dying emergency backup generator. And it was full. There were easily 200 of them. None of them wore armor. None of them held weapons. They were packed, shoulder to shoulder, sitting on the floor. It was a nursery. The adults were on the outer ring, their bodies shielding the inner circle. In the center were the young. Tiny, fragile things with unhardened, translucent shells, clutching at the tunics of their caretakers. When the door fell, they didn't scream. They didn't run. They knew there was nowhere left to go. The silence in the vault was heavier than the rock above them. Hundreds of pairs of yellow eyes turned to look at the doorway, to look at the 5 figures clad in matte black armor, their weapons raised, looking like death incarnate. Ramirez lowered his rifle slightly. "Carter, sir, they're unarmed. They're non-combatants. There are no non-combatants," Carter said. His voice was a flat, dead transmission. The Zelksai High Command didn't spare the agricultural domes on New Wichita. They didn't ask if the farmers were armed. "But they're kids," Ramirez stammered, his righteous anger evaporating, replaced by a sudden, sickening horror. "They are the seeds of a species that tried to exterminate us," Carter replied. "If you leave the root, the weed grows back. Command's orders are absolute, complete sanitation." Dean stood perfectly still. The green tint of his night vision made the huddled masses look like ghosts. He could hear their breathing, a collective, rattling, terrified intake of air. He thought of his sister again. He thought of the ashes. He realized, in that cold, silent moment, the ultimate truth of the war. The Zelksai had destroyed New Wichita with orbital lasers, but they hadn't destroyed humanity. Humanity had destroyed itself. They had burned away their own empathy, their own morality, to survive. They had looked into the abyss, and they hadn't just blinked. They had dived in headfirst, forging themselves into the very monsters they were fighting. The humans hadn't just beaten the Zelksai. They had become worse than them. An old Zelksai in the front row slowly stood up. It didn't raise its hands in surrender. It simply closed its 4 eyes, tilted its head back, and let out a soft, mournful click that echoed off the metal walls. A final prayer to ancestors who couldn't hear them. "Fire," Carter ordered. Miller fired. Gibson fired. Carter fired. The heavy tungsten rounds began their brutal, mathematical work. The adults in the front row fell, their bodies jerking as the rounds punched through them. Ramirez stood frozen, his rifle shaking violently, staring at the slaughter, tears mixing with the sweat on his face. Dean didn't freeze. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't feel a shred of pity or a shred of triumph. The hollow space inside his chest was perfectly, entirely empty. He brought the optic to his eye. He centered the crosshairs. He exhaled. He pulled the trigger. Thwack. And then he pulled it again. And again. And again. He would keep pulling it. On this moon. On the next planet. In the next star system. He would pull it until there was nothing left in the galaxy but the cold iron of human dreadnoughts and the absolute, terrifying silence of the stars. Because the warning had been given. And humanity would never, ever stop walking. If the cold, relentless reality of humanity's vengeance sent a shiver down your spine, do us a massive favor and hit that like button. Share this story with your fellow sci-fi fans who crave grounded, unapologetic tales where the line between hero and monster is completely erased. We pour everything into bringing you these dark, atmospheric journeys across the stars, so make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell to never miss a drop. We want to hear from you. What did you think of Dean's ultimate choice in the vault? Let us know in the comments below.